Imagine you're in a camera store in New York City in 1981 looking at a Canon A-1 and a Canon AE-1 program. What do you think you're going to pay for those cameras? I'll tell you in a minute. Hey everybody, today I want to talk about two of my favorite cameras. This one in my left hand is the Canon A-1 and in my right hand is the Canon AE-1 program. These are two amazing cameras that were made by Canon in the golden age of the SLR back in the 1970s and the 1980s. Maybe you don't have either one of these, or maybe you have one. And if you're curious, you want to know what's the difference between the two, just keep watching. I'll tell you how they're alike and how they differ. I want to level set before we begin with the differences and how they're alike. I want to take a look at the price that you would have paid if you would have walked into a camera store in Manhattan in 1981. So where would you get prices like that? It's pretty easy. Do you remember those little ads we used to squint at in the back of Popular Photography magazine? You'd go to the camera store and you see a camera for like 500 bucks. You would look at the tiny ads in the back of the magazine. You would see all those ads for the big East Coast camera stores. The prices would be all over the place. You'd see that $500 camera shown for $400 at B&H and Adorama, and maybe $300 at some of the lesser known brands. And you wonder, what's the deal? What's the catch? It just goes to show you there's nothing new under the sun. You had to worry about scams even back then. But B&H, they were always above board. Same with Adorama. So I'm looking at prices I got out of the back of October 1981 Popular Photography magazine for Adorama. The A1 in the black went for $325. And if you plug that into the handy dandy online inflation calculator, that turns into $1,125, body alone. The AE-1 program in silver was brand new at the time. This is the new boy on the block. This was selling for $215. Today it'll be $745. What that gets you is $1,125, $745. These were the real prices you would have paid at the register in a camera store in New York. So this isn't some fake thing or something like that. No, these are the real numbers you would have been paying. So that should tell you right away something about how you can compare these two cameras. So first I want to talk about what's the same on these cameras. That way, if there's some feature that you like, you'll know that, hey, the other one does the same thing. Or if there's a feature you don't like that's kind of annoying, well, it's not going to get better if you switch to the other one. So the cameras are identical in shape, and the way you hold them. Look at this. We've got this little sports grip, they call it, on the front here, and we've got the shutter cocking mechanism here and the shutter release. The grip is identical. If you pick one of these up and your hand is on the shutter release and your thumb is on the cocking lever, you can't tell which one you're holding. If you're used to using one of these, you're going to be just fine with the other one. The camera backs are interchangeable. They actually come off. There's a little pin that comes out up here. You slide it out and you could, I believe, I haven't tried it, but I believe you can take this camera back and swap it with the other one. Film path, the loading mechanism, it's all identical. Film goes like in an S-shaped path, up and over, down and under. And it's kind of annoying to load. It's equally annoying on both. The base plates are the same. These will both use motor drives. There's a little bit of a nuance with that, but you can take the same motor drive and use it on either one of these cameras. I don't know anything about flash. I don't use flash, so I'm assuming that the hot shoe behaves the same way in both of these. You look at the front of the camera, they both have the exact same lenses. They use FD mount lenses. They have all the same little features on the front. Let me talk to you about these lenses. So on the back of an FD lens, you'll see this little lever right here. This thing I'm pointing at. that is the piece that tells the camera what aperture you've dialed in on the aperture ring. When Canon made these cameras, the A1 and the AE-1, they did not provide a mechanism for the camera to detect what aperture you set on the ring. And they indicate that in the manual, and they say, well, AE cameras are auto exposure and you let the camera control the aperture. Well, that's fine and dandy, but when you want to use manual controls on these cameras, these two, and it's the same with both of them, the camera doesn't know what aperture you chose. What happens though is the meter in both cameras will read the shutter speed you chose. It will tell you inside the viewfinder, it'll say, oh, I would prefer if you used an aperture of f5.6, but it doesn't know what you've selected. So rather than having a ring and needle match or something like that, you actually will just see a preferred aperture. It's kind of a funny way of manual metering, but that's the way Canon does it. Other things I want to show you up here. So how does it know you're in auto mode? There's an A on there if it can't tell the position of the ring. Well, there's a little pin that I can't see, but the documentation says it's up there somewhere behind where my finger is. And that pin indicates whether you're in the auto mode or not. So that little pin is enough for the lens to tell the camera, it's an auto mode. And a little freebie fact, if you've ever wondered, how does the camera know that this lens is capable of, let's see which one I got here, that this lens is capable of f1.4 and the other lens is f2.8. How does it know that? See this little plastic bump between the two metal levers here? A little plastic bump there. The height of that bump tells the camera what the widest aperture of the lens is. So when they manufactured these, they would mold a higher bump for the f1.4 and a little shorter bump for the f2.8. Cool fact. Now back to the cameras. So as they use FD lenses, everything you have for one camera will work with the other, which is great. They both have a kind of a strange setup on the left side when, as seen by the shooter's hand. Your left hand is on top of three controls. It's identical for these two cameras. One of them is this depth of field preview. This little lever right here, you push it in. And when you're in manual mode, when you've turned the aperture to one of those manual settings, and you press that depth of field, it's going to stop down the aperture and you can look and see how much is in focus. It's quirky. You got to read the manual if you're going to use that, because it only works in certain circumstances. I believe you have to have the shutter cocked or something like that. And every time I go to use it, I always have to fiddle around until I get it to work. The other thing that does is there's a lock mechanism. You flip the end up, push it in, and it locks. And the idea behind that is for stop-down metering. Again, it's a kind of a special process. You would use that with lenses that are not FD lenses. And that's the kind of thing you definitely want to get the manual out and read how to do, read up on the process. Now, these two buttons here on the side of the lens, they are identical on both cameras. You have a little silver button, a silver ringed button in the middle, and another one set a little further back at the top. Same thing on the AE-1 program, same deal. The documentation says a different thing for both cameras. The AE-1 program says something so backwards. I don't even know why they wrote it that way. Something about having to half press the shutter and then press this to lock the exposure and then do something and click the heels 3 times. No! The middle button with the silver around it, the one that's easiest to get to, is an auto exposure preview. It is exactly the same as half pressing the shutter. So you don't want to half press the shutter, you just press this one with your finger, the one that's easiest to get to. And there's a reason you might want to do that, because maybe you want to fiddle with the shutter speed settings or something while looking at what it's doing with your metering. So that one, that's just a preview, just like a half press of the shutter. The one above it is referred to as the auto exposure memory button, the instructions for the A-1. It's an auto exposure lock. You press that button and it's going to show you the exposure that it's calculated in the viewfinder, and it's going to lock that in until you release the button. You don't need to touch the shutter. You don't need to do anything else. If you're pointing the camera at something, you press that, it's going to take an exposure reading and you will see the aperture it's going to use inside the viewfinder. At that point, you can even move the camera around, recompose, and if you want, you can rotate the shutter speed and just choose another one, and you'll see the aperture's changing to match the existing exposure reading. So for that, it's really handy. You just point the camera at something you want to expose on, press that button in, recompose, maybe adjust your shutter speed, and take the shot. It would be less useful if you had to do it the way that the AE-1 program's manual says to do it. Ignore that. Read the A1 manual for how to use this little button, and it works just fine. Let me continue talking about the things that are the same between these two cameras. I told you that the cocking the shutter is identical between them. The power switch works the same way. There's a lock position in the middle and a power position in the front. Both cameras require a battery to fire the shutter. Both cameras have an electromagnetic shutter mechanism. You'll see electromagnets under here if you ever take the bottom off, or you look online to see pictures of these taken apart. So that's kind of annoying that if the battery dies, you cannot fire the shutter. Something else kind of annoying is the way they made this little lock switch. If you push this in the camera bag, it's going to go to the on position. They both have a timer, self-timer. They both have ISO over here. They have the rewinder here. On the bottom, you've got your little rewind button, the one that releases the film so you can rewind it. There's a little dot on that on both cameras. And what that little dot does is, let me show you this one. The little dot rotates as you move film through the film path. This little button is actually the bottom pivot of the sprocket mechanism. So as the sprocket is turning, that little dot will be moving. That tells you, as you're cocking the shutter and when you're loading film, that tells you film is moving. And it also tells you when you get to the end of the roll and you're rewinding, you can see when that little dot stops moving. If you want to leave the tail out, stop rewinding, pop open the back, and take the film out at that point. Both cameras do that. They both have the same PC adapter here for flash, and there's a little cover that goes on that. I don't have one on this camera, but I do on this camera. Battery cover is in the same place. Everything about these that I've covered, the feel, the way you use it, it's pretty much identical. Now, let's talk about how they differ. First and foremost, the AE-1 program has shutter priority and program modes. So you can put it in program, let the camera do everything. You can put it in shutter priority, choose the shutter speed, it'll choose the aperture, and you can, of course, use it in manual. This camera, the A1, has shutter priority and aperture priority. You can put it in program mode, just like the AE-1 program. You can put it in shutter priority mode and choose a shutter speed, it'll choose an aperture. And you can put it in aperture priority mode, choose an aperture, it'll choose a shutter speed, and then you can always use it manual. Shutter speeds. On the A1, you have additional shutter speeds that you don't get on the AE-1. The A1 will go as slow as 30 seconds. There's the top is 1/1000th. Yeah, 1/1000th, and it goes down to 30 seconds in length. The AE-1, it starts at 1/1000th, and it goes all the way down to 2 seconds. And of course, you have a bulb position on both cameras. Let me show you how the aperture priority mechanism works in the A1. It's actually really clever, and fiddly at the same time. It's really clever because what they've done is you'll see a little ring that goes around what would be the shutter speed dial. It's actually a ring that's around the shutter release. But it's right above the shutter speed dial. And if you twist that, you'll notice there's two positions on there. It's got a position that says TV and a position that says AV. Those are Canon speak for shutter priority and aperture priority. And TV means, I think it's a time variable, and AV would be aperture variable. Well, what'll happen is when you twist that from TV to AV, the display changes. The scale on the dial changes from black to yellow, and all the numbers change from shutter speeds to apertures. And so you use the exact same dial. It is fiddly to use. It's fun because it's a really cool thing. I love switching between those and watching the scale change from yellow to black to yellow. But if you're on aperture priority, you have to turn it back to shutter priority in order to get into program mode, because the P is only on the shutter priority dial. And it's my opinion that an aperture priority camera should let you select the aperture on the ring. But neither of these cameras does anything beyond manual when you start messing around with the aperture ring. So that makes this little feature not quite the big win that you might think it would be. And when we look at the AE-1 program with its humble shutter speed only dial, it's a much nicer dial to spin. And you would think that not having aperture priority is a liability. But what you do is you just press the little preview button over here. It's like a half click of a shot. You press that and it will show you the apertures that the camera is going to use. All you need to do is press that in as you're metering and dial your shutter speed dial until you see the aperture you want show up in the viewfinder. And that's the aperture the camera's going to use. So you're not really missing out on anything. The self-timer is different. You have a 10-second self-timer and it uses a beep on this AE-1. And let me put it there. I will cock the shutter and you hear that. And it's going to do 10 seconds and there we go. The A1 doesn't have any sound, and so what happens is, let me put it on the 10 seconds, you get this flashing light, which serves the same purpose, and it's going to do the blink, 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 blink kind of thing right there, and there we go. Other thing that the A1 does that's different is they have two self-timer speeds. You've got a 10-second and a 2-second. AE-1 program doesn't have the 2-second. A1 has the 2-second. Now, why would you need a 2-second self-timer speed? It's not so that you can press your shutter and run over to your spot beside grandma in 2 seconds. No, the 2-second self-timer is a poor man's cable release. You use that when you're doing like macro photography and you don't want to bump the camera. So you just put it on a 2-second delay and you press the shutter and 2 seconds later it fires. It's a nice feature. Is it real important? Nah. But that brings me to something else about these two cameras. When you do self-timer shots and when you use a cable release, basically anytime you're not looking through the viewfinder, they tell you in the manual to cover the eyepiece. The reason is, especially with the self-timer, the camera will do one last meter just before it opens the shutter because it wants to have the most up-to-date light information. So 10 seconds, and at that last instant, it meters again, and then it will choose the aperture and shutter speed accordingly. Well, the problem is light can get in through the viewfinder and affect the meter reading. So what you do on the Canon AE-1 program, it's similar to a lot of cameras we've had over the years, where you take this little piece of plastic and it fits over the window. Kind of a cheap and cheerful way of doing this. Sometimes they have little clips or whatever. The A1 is a little classier than that. They actually have a little shutter, a little lever there. You click that lever and it closes the little shutter. Is it a big deal? Not really. I've never remembered to do this. And I shoot a lot of macro and I do a lot of tripod work. And I've never remembered to actually flip that little thing. And I don't think I've ever had a problem with it. Other features that are different. The A1 will do multi-exposure. And you don't have that available on the AE-1 program. The way you do that is just a little tiny nub right here next to the cocking lever. And you use your thumbnail and you sort of poke that in. And there, you can now cock the shutter again and take another shot. And it won't advance the film. And there's a kind of a strange little thing you need to do if you're doing that. Remember I was talking about the stop-down metering. If you're playing around with stop-down metering, you can get yourself into a weird mode where the display will show errors, E's all the way across, and it's a bug, I think, and the manual even tells you, well, to fix that, just press this little thing in, cock the shutter once, and the error condition should go away. Oh, well, that's cool. So if you ever see all E's across the display in this camera, oh, that's how to fix it. The ISO side, you've got the ISO dial here on, this is the A1. You have an exposure compensation dial here, and it gives you 2 up and 2 down. And they don't talk about it as 1 or 2. It's actually double or half. That's the way they've written it. But it's a little button, you press that button and then you can move this exposure compensation dial. The ISO dial is a really nice feel, but it's a pain to use. There's a little metal thing you've got to kind of hook your finger under. It's right in there. And just trying to squeeze that and turn the ISO dial, well, you don't set it that often, but it's not as easy to use as the AE-1 program. This guy doesn't have any exposure compensation, but what it does have is a much easier to use ISO dial. So you press the button that would have been exposure compensation on the A1, you press that, and you can easily rotate with a little nub on the edge. You can set your ISO. And if you want to do exposure compensation, just change your ISO. It does the same thing, and it's a whole lot easier to do on this camera. Don't forget to put it back. The cameras both have a battery test. There's a little button right next, in the same place on both. On the A1, the battery test will flash the LED. On the AE1, it'll make a sound. Now I'm going to talk about the viewfinder. In my opinion, the viewfinder picture, the display, the information shown by the A1 wins hands down. The A1 will show you in beautiful 7-segment display LED digits. It'll show you your shutter speed and then the aperture, and it's really nice. It'll show like error modes and things like that, but the fact that you look in there and you see it as clear as day, shutter speed and aperture, and it'll tell you if you're in manual mode or if you're in program. And that's about it. There's not much more to these cameras. They're very simple cameras. If you're shooting with the AE-1 program, there's a series of LEDs on the right side of the frame that have labels, and they're just labeled with the apertures. And there's a P and there's an M. That's all you've got. So when you're shooting in shutter priority, you select the shutter speed, and when you half press, you're going to see the one LED for, say, f5.6 is going to light up. And it's just not enough information. It doesn't tell you the shutter speed you're using. And worse still, if you look at it with one eye, and for me, if I'm looking at it with my right eye, I cannot see those numbers. If I look at it with my left eye, I can see them. They're in the peripheral vision. I can't the blind spot you have from where the optic nerve is. It turns out that I just cannot see those when I'm using one of my eyes. And you'll find that out, that it just doesn't work. You have to use the other eye. You can see them. The display inside the A1 wins hands down. It's clear digits. You can see them. And they show you both the shutter speed and aperture. When you use the AE-1 program in program mode, you will never know the shutter speed this camera used. It doesn't tell you. So if you like to write your metadata down like I do, you're never going to know. Whereas you will always have both when you shoot this guy. Something else I'll tell you about these two cameras is the actual focusing screen is older style on the A1. This was a 1978 camera, and it's not as bright. They came up with a newer technology when they made the AE-1 program, and it's brighter, and AE-1 wins. As far as the quality of the focusing screen, it's much better. And you can take it out and replace it. This focusing screen was meant to be consumer replaceable. The one in the A1 was meant to be replaced by a technician. It's not rocket science. You can find videos online how to do it, but I really like the fact that you can change the focusing screen by hand. You just get a new one on eBay and you can replace the one on the Canon AE-1 program. The AE-1 program is not capable of the shutter rate that the A1 is. If you put a motor drive on these two cameras, you're going to get in a fast speed. The A1 will shoot 5 frames per second, and the AE1 will max out at 2.5 frames per second. And I don't know who's shooting sports photography with these film cameras these days, but if you do, you probably want to get the A1 because it's going to be able to shoot faster. There's a weird little feature here where they've got a little lock mechanism. You can flip that up and it will lock the dial for the shutter speed or the aperture. I don't know why they put that there. The only time I ever notice is when I accidentally flip it on and lock those dials. Kind of annoying. The A1 has another kind of cool feature. They have a little switch right here, and if you flip that switch, it turns off everything in the viewfinder. They did that because they felt that there were photographers out there that would like to be immersed in the moment and not have extraneous LEDs or whatever in their way. They don't have that in this guy. So let's talk about the build quality. A1 wins. That's where some of that money went. You can tell there's more metal. This is more plasticky. The main body itself feels the same, but the plastic shows up in places like the ISO dial. This is really plasticky. Same with the rewind knob. Whereas on the A1, both of those are metal, and it feels better. Other things that I've mentioned about, they're all quibbles. Biggest deal is whether or not you want that good display on the inside or whether you want the better screen and whether you want aperture priority. Neither camera is perfect in its user interface, but they're pretty close, especially for cameras made in the late 70s and early 80s. These were designed in the 70s, basically, 1970s technology. And they are great cameras. They feel great. And I love having both of them because I can go out with either one. And it's just like, it's like trying to pick which of your children you like best. They're both good cameras. For all of the cheap parts of this AE-1 program, I look at it and I feel like how easy it is to rotate that the dial, and how it doesn't have some of these other fiddly modes that the A1 does. It's all business. This camera is just, you just pick it up and shoot it. You really don't need all the other features that come with the A1. But if you like those features, and I gotta admit, this camera looks really good in black. It just looks great. You can get a black AE-1. They exist. But something about it's got a great look to it. It has points for having extra features. It loses points for things like all the fiddliness about how you do your aperture priority versus shutter priority. Now, these are both consumer grade cameras. I would consider the A1 to be a prosumer grade camera and the AE-1 to be a consumer grade camera. What's the difference between these and a professional camera? Well, at the time you would have bought a Canon F1N, new version of the Canon F1. That would have been the professional camera. So what's the difference? There's a lot of features that a professional grade camera has that you won't find on either of these. Example, on a professional camera, you can take off the viewfinder, the prism. It'll come right off, and you can buy different kinds of prism or viewfinder features and things, different kind of viewfinders you can put on there. You have a look down, or you can angle, whatever. Other things, bulk film packs on the back, much more robust construction, the ability to do mirror lockup so you don't have any vibrations when you're in a long exposure, those kinds of things. But you won't find those features on consumer grade cameras, and neither of these has those kind of features. With that said, it's come to my attention that the F1 is missing some features that these cameras have. And one of these days I want to get one, and when I do, I'll do another video where I talk about the differences between the F1 and these guys. At the end of the day, I love shooting both of them. I like the fact that I can get good lenses very cheap, and they're fun cameras. I have all these other cameras I really like. They're kind of cool. The most recent addition was a Rolly 35. I went out shooting with that last weekend. These are the cameras that deliver the mail. When I want to go out and just take pictures, it's going to be one of these two. And sometimes I'll take both, and I'll have different films in them, or maybe have one with a wide angle and the other with maybe a normal lens or a telephoto or something like that. Buy two, they're cheap. They're both well constructed. There's so many of them out there that you can find them in great condition. Don't settle for dented up and beat up ones. Spend a little bit more money. Get them in perfect condition, because you can find them like that. And you can still get them CLA'd. You can get lenses for great prices. These are awesome. You won't be disappointed. Well, that's all I got for you today. Thank you for watching. Now go out and shoot a roll.